Hello guys, welcome. I think it's about that time. So glad everyone could make it. This is going to be a good class. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll begin by doing our bilateral stimulation, centering. So as you guys know, we'll go back and forth with our eyes. We do this about 20 or 30 times. And you may even immediately feel it. Different things you can notice as it stimulates both sides of the brain, thus harmonizing both hemispheres of the brain instead of being dominant on one side and having the inclination to think a particular way. This opens us up to seeing a more whole picture. And now we'll also do that to our body by tensing and relaxing on both sides alternately. Starting with your foot, one side, tense, relax, and then the other side, tense, relax. And we'll go a little bit faster than maybe we normally do, so just back and forth 3 times. And we'll move up to our calf, and then the other side, back and forth 3 times. And then our upper leg, back and forth 3 times. And then our buttocks, back and forth 3 times. And our lower back, it's a little bit tricky to isolate sometimes. Just do the best you can. It's all helpful. And then your middle back, I usually do by pushing my shoulder back. And then upper back, by pulling the shoulder to the ear. And then your hands, alternately, 3 times on both sides, then your forearm, then your bicep, and then both sides of your neck alternately. Do the best you can, and then lastly the forehead up and down as you see a stream of light moving in through the back of your head and filling your body while inhaling. So here we'll move our forehead as we see the light and inhale. And then exhale. Now this time we'll just breathe in while we see the light stream. And then exhale. And then one more time with the stream of light while we breathe in. And then exhale. All right, you guys, we made it. We're here, we're present. I wanted to open class this time with another kind of personal story of what I've been seeing in my own life and the realizations I've been coming to from it. I've been watching our kids, and at times they'll get upset when they want something and can't have it. This is a universal experience of being a child. And so I started to look at that a little bit, and I wondered what was really going on there. And I started to see that they want something and don't know how to get it. And so there's the throwing of the fit in order to persuade the parents to get it. So I started to think, what if we devised a way to where they could see how to get it? And so we created a chore structure to where they would get paid for it. So they could see the steps it would take to get what they want. Well, we'll see how that ends up panning out, but as for now, that's what the structure is. And then I started to think about my own personal fit throwing that we all do, whether that's an outward expression or whether that's an inward expression, whether it's just the fit throwing that our mind does. And so this class today is going to be largely about coming to an understanding of the one in us who throws a fit. And so I think that the understanding is the mind does that when it doesn't understand how to get what it wants. And so maybe they wanted candy, and that's why the kids were throwing a fit. Well, we now, as adults, understand that when we want candy, we know the steps to get it. That's not a problem. We don't have to throw a fit about candy anymore. However, we still do throw fits, whether that's externally verbalized or whether that's mentally. We don't throw a fit with candy, but the place that we do throw fits at is, instead of being physical like candy, it's the intangible. We throw fits when we don't know how to feel the way we want to feel, or when our thoughts aren't the way we want our thoughts to be. So we get the physical component now. We don't have to throw a fit about candy or a video game or food or whatever it might be. But we still do, or at least our mind does, throw fits about the intangible thoughts and emotions. And so, in this class, we're going to better understand how to get what we want. It's kind of like cutting down a tree. As an adult, we understand that there are steps, there's some action involved, and it takes some time. And we also know that throwing a fit wouldn't help the whole process. Throwing a fit doesn't cut down the tree. And so I think it would be helpful if we started seeing our own thoughts and our own emotions as a tree. It can't just be casted to the side. There is action, there is steps. It takes time to remove the thoughts, to remove the emotion. And it doesn't help whenever a mind throws a fit about the thoughts or the emotion. Just like it doesn't help when it wouldn't help to throw a fit about the tree being there when you want it cut down. And so I want to begin to solidify very strongly that whatever is currently here is like a tree, and it's unmovable, and it's not helpful to think that it is movable. Even though it, as everything else does, will change, will move with time. These thoughts and emotions that are currently present are as rooted as a tree. And it doesn't help to throw a fit about a tree being there when you don't want it there. So we're going to highlight that in a couple different ways in class today. There are steps to getting rid of our thoughts. There are steps to getting rid of our emotions. And the first step is not trying to get rid of them and seeing them as permanent as a tree. And when we don't understand that they are as permanent as a tree and there are steps, then the mind throws a fit, much like a child does, wanting something to be different, wanting candy. So the next example I have is and this example will highlight the way that we interact with ourselves, the fit throwing, that is similar to the way that we interact with someone close to us in our life, particularly in an argument or some type of disagreement kind of situation. And we're going to highlight this this interaction between two people who are arguing to more clearly see the way that we throw a fit within ourselves. And then we're going to see how it works better when interacting with someone else, so we can more clearly see how it works better to interact with ourselves. So in this example, let's imagine two people arguing. It's someone you're close to, you arguing with someone you're close to. And I say someone you're close to because that's the person that the way you interact with yourself on your own time throughout the day comes out. The way that you interact and deal with and communicate in your own mind in response to stuff that's coming up in your own mind is the same way you communicate and interact and respond to stuff that someone else says in a conversation. And this person who's close to you could be a significant other, it could be someone you're married to, it could be a mother, father, it could be a sibling, it could be a best friend, someone who you're close to. So you can imagine this person. And then imagine an argument that began. Kind of like we talked in previous classes, there's the back and forth, and this argument is really ignorance, but not only that, there builds an intensity in an argument. And so there's an emotional intensity and a general, you feel it in the body. And that's really what the child does when trying to get the candy. It doesn't understand how to get what it wants. It'll go back and forth. You could even get caught up in it too. Particularly if that's how you deal with yourself on your own time. So in our own minds, if you notice that same thing, like say your mind says something, and then there's a response to it back, and these responses are more reactions and they grow and build and and then you feel it in your body just like it was an outer argument, but there was no one else involved. This way that we interact with ourselves is the same way that we would react to someone else given that particular topic, and given that they were close to you. So the way that we interact with ourselves comes out with the people who are closest to us. And it's a bit like throwing a fit. Now I want to highlight a different way to approach it. And we're going to sum it up in one word. Listening. And so it can be tricky to do this. It can be tricky to just listen and let the other person organically keep talking, keep building up the intensity and keep talking. Maybe they're upset and keep doing it without the attempt to input back, to engage back. It can be tricky. In the same way within our own mind, the practice of mindfulness, and it can be tricky at first, is to practice waiting for a thought to come up, and instead of proving it wrong or thinking how it is wrong or giving the evidence of how it's wrong or giving another perspective even or whatever that will just make it more energized with the converse response, and then back, instead of that whole thing in the mind, just be the listener who allows the thought itself just to be and do in its organic way that it's going to be and do. Thought thinks. That's what it does. The breath breathes. That's just what it does. And so we are learning to be the listener. Instead of the one who throws a fit in response to what organically just came up. Thought thinks it's going to organically come up. We have to find more intelligent ways to work with these things, both for our own inner experience and also for interactions with the people who are closest to us. So listening. That's going to be one of the key words for class today. It's kind of like a friend. If you really wanted to understand someone, you would listen. Every sentence that they said, you wouldn't have a response back if you really wanted to understand. And so this is the approach we're going to be beginning to take with ourselves. If we really want to understand ourselves, we would listen. We wouldn't have the argumentative response back to every single thing. We're just being the listener and seeing what organically arises. And maybe it'll be a bunch of thoughts that proliferate wildly, in which case, attempt to let it do that without getting sucked into it, without being identified with it. Or maybe it's just a thought that arises and then drifts away. And that is such a fulfilling experience to see happen. To not have to interact with every thought that comes up. It's just like a person, a friend of yours who you're attempting to understand. If they were in pain, every thought they say wouldn't be of the highest caliber. Many things they would say, because they're in pain and confused, wouldn't be totally in alignment. It wouldn't make total sense. You would know better than that. But you wouldn't need to argue everything that they said. You would just be able to listen. And in the open listening, you would be collecting enough information to where after listening for an extended period of time, then you would have the information and the insight to be able to respond intelligently. This is the same thing with ourselves. We're practicing to listen to ourselves as if we were listening to understand a friend. Someone who needs help. And so we listen. And as we listen, these thoughts may come up and we're just collecting information. We may not have any insight or any answer in that moment, or even in the next hour, or even in the next day, or even the next few days. But we're listening. And after you get enough information, the insight naturally comes to you. I have this experience all the time with teaching, and for those of us who's helped someone before, listened, and they've gotten enough information, they know immediately, oh, this is the answer. It just comes to you, insight. So I can't tell you how many times that I've had a student who was telling me some difficulty or some problem that they're trying to understand. And then they stopped talking. And I was very much objectively listening, not thinking for an answer, just receiving. But the answer hadn't come to me yet. The insight hadn't come to me yet. And they stopped talking. And so I'm like, can you say more words? I don't know how many times I've used that phrase. I just need to hear more words from you. And then, so they start talking again. And lo and behold, every time, after enough information is gathered, then there's the insight. So this is the practice we're beginning to apply to ourselves. Instead of the argumentative back and forth, which leads nowhere, which is ignorance, we are learning to listen to ourselves, to gather information. And it may not happen in this moment. It may not happen this hour, or today, or tomorrow. But you'll gather enough information if you listen to what yourself is saying. The thoughts that organically just come up. You don't need to make thoughts come up. They just do it on their own. And so what is this thought maker within you? What is it saying? What is this part of you saying? It's just like you wouldn't fight a friend or a student with every 2 sentences they said. You wouldn't have a response back. That would be not building an understanding. So we're practicing to build an understanding of ourselves. We do that through listening. And you don't need to be in a mindful state to be able to listen. You can even be in the middle of an intense emotional thought proliferation where they're just going like crazy. And if we just remember to listen to the thoughts, which immediately puts you in a kind of separate place from them, which is really the whole practice of mindfulness anyways. And so just listen. In order to listen to a thought without engaging, that is seeing clearly. That is mindfulness. That is being disidentified. That is freedom. That is mindfulness. Everyone's always trying to better understand this clear space of mind that we talk about in mindfulness. And I think there's a really good analogy of watching a movie. So you're at the movie theater and there's a huge screen and the loudspeakers just booming at you. That's what life is like. That's intense. And while watching this movie with all this very sensory engaging, highly intense experience, you lose yourself in the character. And that can be fun. That can be wonderful. And you experience the joys and happiness of the character and also the anger and the sorrow of the character. You're one and the same with the character. However, maybe the person behind you coughs. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, I'm in a movie theater. That's the experience of waking up from our thoughts. That's the experience of waking up from our emotions. And for me, there's even a visual cue that goes along with it. And this is really fascinating. When I look out my eyes, things visually look more clear. So in the practice of mindfulness, in the practice of coming from the one who sees, being disidentified, waking up while watching the movie, there are visual cues. And so while you practice these things, watch. When do things look different? What is the response? What's going on in the mind when things outwardly look different? Am I more relaxed? Is there an attitude of frustration? And I used to think that I had to be totally emotionally clear to be able to see clearly. But now I'm seeing that seeing clearly can also incorporate whatever emotional state is present. It's just seeing clearly that there is an emotional state. It's kind of like the organic thought arising. I'm just listening. If you want to say listening, that's the word we've been using, listening. Or you could say, I just know that the emotion is there. And that is the clear seeing. That is being disidentified. Now here's what usually happens, is the emotion organically arises, and we immediately become identified with that and it being a problem. And so there's the thought of what you think the emotion is, and then how we need to get rid of that because of these reasons, and how we need to do this, and blah, blah, blah. And so now we are identified with the movie screen. We are identified with what is not us. We're lost. We're not seeing clearly. But if we can just remain mindful of the emotion when it arises, then we can see clearly and be mindful while being emotional. Some things that can help with that, if that's not super easy to do, is some of the other topics from earlier classes, such as want equals suffering and knowing equaling ignorance. Those things can begin to break down the compulsivity, the energized automatic mind responses or resistances or aversions to the emotions that are arising. When those are broken down more and more, seeing the futility in the knowing or the wanting this emotion to be different, then our mind is more calm. And it can stay mindful of and grounded in the reality of exactly what's happening, which is an emotion, which is anger, which is jealousy, which is frustration. So mindfulness can be rooted back to just listening. I want to read for you, from the Mindfulness book again. And there's a couple paragraphs here that I think highlight this well. Highlight even the importance of emotion. Instead of getting lost in the stories about emotion and trying to figure them out and fix them, we can begin to even see the value in them. The value in them in our mindfulness practice even. How they actually add to our mindfulness practice, awakening. Feelings of struggle can become very useful feedback. They are always telling us that something is going on that we're not accepting, not open to, because if we were accepting it, we wouldn't be struggling. So anytime you notice a struggle, and that can be really good feedback that there's something that you're not accepting, something you're not open to. So we can reflect back. What happened when this struggle began? And then we can begin to look at it in different ways, begin to open to it by even seeing the value of it and the necessity of it, even in an evolutionary perspective. The person, the topic, the feeling, whatever it is, everything has a purpose and so therefore value. And the struggle comes from not accepting that thing, and it's easier to accept when we see the purpose and value of it. So the struggle, if you notice yourself struggling, it can be very valuable feedback. And tells you that there's something that you're not accepting, something you're not open to. Be aware of moods and emotions. So often we go through a day or part of one influenced by a certain mood or emotion. It might be sadness or boredom or excitement. It might be some irritation or a feeling of clarity or depression or happiness. Anything. Because these moods and mind states are so generalized, we often sink into them and become identified with them, and they become the unconscious filter on experience. At these times, we're looking at the world through colored glasses. So when we can be mindful of an emotion as it comes up, then we don't have to get lost in that emotion's movie, because every emotion will have particular brand of thought that goes along with it. And that colors the experience of the rest of our time we're in that emotion, perhaps the rest of our day. And so if we can just remain mindful of the emotion, then we don't have to go into the back and forth, which is being identified and lost in the thought related to that emotion. This is most seen clearly, like, I don't know, here's a bottle of water. Say normally, this is a pretty neutral item, but say normally you like water, and water's totally fine. But then whenever you get sad or mad, you hate water. It's like, or maybe not even water in general, but even just like someone offers you water, and you're like, no, I hate water. So as an emotion comes in, it has a whole host of thoughts that go along with it. And they're not even ours. But because we are identified with the movie and not just listening to it and seeing it as it arises, then we live out those mind states. We live out those thoughts from the emotion. Furthermore, emotions and moods are often what we most personalize. We take it to be us versus just being the one who listens to whatever organically is arising. When we identify with them, we build a superstructure on top of the shifting landscape of experience. So it's like the shifting landscape of experience is emotion in this case. But when we identify with them, the superstructure begins to be all these thoughts about the emotion or about whatever's happening in our life. So all these thoughts is a superstructure on top of the simplicity of what's actually happening. Superstructure is things like I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm happy, and all the stories that go along with it. But as we practice this mindfulness of mind, we notice more clearly what mood or emotion is present and how it is coloring or conditioning the mind. We simply know the angry mind is like this. The sad mind is like this. The happy mind is like this. Experiencing the mind in this way opens us up to what is known as a taste of freedom. So when we become identified with the movie, we lose our freedom. And so it's just to know, oh, anger is like this. Sadness is like this. And we're remaining mindful of it. So what does that really mean? What does that look like in the moment, remaining mindful? It's a continuity of attention. It's holding your attention on whatever is present, like it's a tree. If you didn't hold your attention, you hold a general knowing that the tree is there when you're walking past it. Then you may forget it's there, and it would hurt you when you bumped into it. Same way with our thoughts. Same way with these emotions when they come up. You know, hold a general continuity of our attention on it, a general knowing that it's there. Otherwise, they may end up hurting us as we become identified with them. Get lost in the stories of the emotion, which isn't any factual reality. It's only a superstructure on top of it. The water being stupid isn't a factual reality. That's only the superstructure on top of the water, which under different mind states and emotions you love. So in order not to become identified with this and become entrapped, We're just simply being mindful of it, of whatever the reality, becoming grounded in the reality of whatever is currently present. It doesn't even matter. Just see it as a tree. This emotion that's there, these thoughts that are there, they can't be moved. We don't need to get lost in the story of how it's bad. This is just what it is in this moment. Just know what it is. Makes things a lot simpler. There's no need to throw mental fits about anything. It's a tree. It can't be moved right now. With time, it will dissipate. Thought or emotion. With time, the tree would eventually dissipate. As it dies and decays. Or even we can work with our thoughts and emotions more intelligently. In which case, there are steps and it takes time. Same way if we wanted to work with the tree and get rid of the tree, then there are steps and it takes time. You could cut it. But we don't need to throw a fit about what is present. We can just see it as permanently there. In this very moment, it's permanently there like a tree. Here's a quote by the Buddha. It's this last part that I'm going to read. It says, "Within itself, the mind is already peaceful." That blew me away when I first heard it. It made me re-identify what the mind is. The mind is already peaceful. And so the thing that's not peaceful is when we are identified with the movie screen, when we are identified with the emotions and the thoughts they bring. Like, here's the mind. And what's not peaceful is when we are identified with these things. And that means the thought, the mind, here's the mind right here, goes and does that. That's when it's not peaceful. But the mind itself, just as the one who sees, the listening one, in and of itself is peaceful. Particularly when we can just be mindful of the reality of what's happening. Be rooted in, oh, this is an emotion. We don't need to have a bunch of thoughts about the emotion and get involved or start interacting with it in a way that is argumentative, kind of like whenever two people will argue. We're just learning to listen, to just be mindful of its presence. And that is the mind already peaceful. That the mind is not peaceful these days is because it follows moods. It becomes agitated because moods deceive it. The untrained mind is stupid, ignorant. Sense impressions come and trick it into happiness, suffering, gladness, sorrow. But the mind's true nature is none of these things. Gladness or sadness is not the mind, but only a mood coming to deceive us. The untrained mind gets lost and follows these things. It forgets itself. When we think that it is we who are upset or at ease or whatever. But really, this mind of ours is already unmoving and peaceful. Already peaceful. So we must train the mind to recognize these sense impressions and not get lost in them. Just this is the aim of all the mindfulness practices we put ourselves through. Just this is the aim of everything we do in these classes. Is to see that the mind's true nature is calmness. When the mind knows, when the mind's grounded in reality, which may be this emotion here, when it knows, and it's not, when it's like this, And it's not doing this thing with reality like the kids do whenever they want something to be different. They throw a fit. This is the mind throwing a fit about reality when we're just grounded in the simplicity. Grounded in reality. Oh, right now there's anger. There's desire. And I'm moving forward with that's what's happening in my human's life right now. There's desire. So I'm just being mindful. I'm just waking up to what's happening. It's like the person coughing behind us at the movie theater. We're just waking up to that we're watching a movie. And the other indicator is looking at your eyes and practicing looking at your eyes and seeing when you notice a difference in this. You have to discern it for yourself. Practice. Practice listening is what we're calling it. To whatever organically arises, whatever thought or emotion. Practice listening. Even if you're in a wild state of all kinds of thoughts, you can practice listening to yourself. Be a friend to yourself. Truly try to understand in a way that you'll have enough information to be able to respond back to yourself with some insight, with something intelligent. We're beginning to discover the mind's true nature as peaceful. Whenever we realize that all the mind needs is some direction, some focus. And to stay rooted in that knowing. We're directing it, focusing it towards knowing what's going on. There is this emotion. There is this frustration. And it's no dang big deal. We don't need to throw a fit about it like the kids would, not knowing how to get what they want. We can just have not what we want right now. It's a tree. If we not want the tree there, we're not going to throw a fit. We're going to be with it, evaluate what needs to happen, if that's even what we're doing. And the point is to stay rooted in the reality of what's happening. It's just to catch a glimpse of the reality of what's happening. And to see emotions and thoughts as trees that are unmovable will be highly helpful in being grounded in the reality of what's happening. Okay. I've got one last thing to read to us. This can be used as a kind of analogy, a kind of image that can be helpful. When interacting and working with your own mind. So he uses the word defilements in this paragraph. We've used that word before. Generally it means, in our teaching for today, what it would mean is a defilement would be the throwing a fit, the back and forth thing that we do either externally or internally about something. That would be a kind of defilement. It would be the mind not being its pure rooted state, knowing the reality of what's happening. A defilement is when the mind would become identified with the movie screen and starts to do this stuff. And so that would be a defilement. So here's the image. Here's the example. One thing you need to remember and understand is that you cannot leave the mind alone. And at times the tendency can be to want to break free from it entirely. But we have a mind, and what the mind does is thinks. And what the breath does is breathe. Things do just what they're going to do. They're like a tree. I'm going to read this again. One thing you need to remember and understand is that you cannot leave the mind alone. It needs to be watched constantly. If you do not look after your garden, it will overgrow with weeds. If you do not watch your mind, defilements, weeds, ignorance, will grow and multiply. The mind does not belong to you, but you are responsible for it. So we can begin to see our mind as a garden. And if we're watching our garden, we're knowing the reality of what's happening, then we can catch any weeds right when they start to come up. Or you could say, we're listening to the organic thought or the organic weed as it comes up. And by not interacting with it, it's a kind of pulling the weed. Because we're not identified with it. However, in our practice, if we're not watching the garden, meaning the reality of what's happening, we become identified with the movie, then this is the weed. All sorts of weeds, literally, right there, come up. And you can't even pull it because you aren't watching the garden. You think that you are the garden. And this is freedom. It's freedom just being rooted in the reality of what's happening. It's freedom to think that what's happening is an unmovable tree. It's freedom to think that what is happening is an unmovable tree. All right, you guys. That was our class for today, and Awaken to Happiness, an introduction or an application of mindfulness. And as our last thing that we do in class today, I'd like to aid in this understanding that we're coming to by doing a kind of in-class mindfulness experience. And so I'm going to guide us through that. Even while we're talking about these things, it probably became pretty clear in what we are talking about. However, there are some things in our practice that is not so immediately obvious that I wanted to guide us through. So the first thing, in any moment that you're practicing, you can decide to practice in any second, no matter where you are, what you're doing, how your body's positioned, what you're feeling. So mindfulness is just waking up to the reality of what's happening. So in this moment, however the heck your body is, just become mindful of it. There's not any particular way that it needs to be. There are three main components in mindfulness. Mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of emotion or feeling, and mindfulness of thought or mind. And so we're going to start with mindfulness of the body. And besides the actual physical posture, we're also mindful of any sensations: hot, cold, pressure, heat, tingling. And even if there's pain, it can go into some type of direct sensation, as well as the other direct sensation words we just listed. Our body is a constantly changing, shifting element. It's constantly elements shifting and changing. So we're beginning to get out of things like the concept of hand into the direct experience of hand. So in the mindfulness of the body, even place your attention on your hand and feel it. Get out of the concept of hand and actually feel it. You could probably feel the energy in it, the always changing field of energy that it is. Tingling, cold, heat. There's almost even an aliveness to it. And when we become truly mindful of our body, then that's the experience of our body instead of the deadening concept of body. And our body's always shifting. It's an energy field that's always shifting. And so the body at any particular point may be feeling a particular way now, but it won't always be. And so the concept of hand or body doesn't really give you the direct experience of it. So you don't really know it. You're not grounded in the reality of it. So in mindfulness of body, emotion, or thought, we're just knowing the reality of it beyond the concept to the direct experience of it. So to do that, we place our attention on it and hold our attention there. And same thing when moving to emotion. When we're mindful of emotion, we're just aware, using different words now. We did use words like listening. We're just aware that the emotion is present. And it's like a tree. It just is there. We don't need to throw a fit about it internally. We can even walk around while having this awareness. We could even jump out of an airplane while having the awareness of how the body feels. Having an awareness of the adrenaline. Instead of identified fully with the picture in the movie, we can be aware. So we're just being aware of the emotion in the body. And then we can also be aware, be listening to any thought that organically arises. Gathering information, you could call it. And then eventually, after enough information is gathered and you listen to your friend, then an insight will come. That will help. And then to make this really practical, the next step is, how do we do something? And so it's a delicate trick. It takes practice of beginning to know what you're going to move forward with next, in which case now that is a knowing. So I'm moving forward with this, and you know that you're moving forward with this. And so you can get up and do whatever thing. And be mindful if the mind wants to start identifying too heavily or throwing a fit, and then it gets lost and identified with the movie screen. So we're constantly making a priority of being rooted in the reality of the present moment. What is the reality here? Our tendency is just immediately become identified with whatever project or work or whatever our focus is. It's just immediately identified. And we're just practicing to know the reality of what's happening. And there's a kind of keeping your attention here in the present moment that it takes to be able to know the reality of what's happening while moving forward with what you're doing in your life. And or it could look like an oscillation, to where there will be moments when you completely identify with what you're talking about. That's an amazing capacity that we have as humans. And then oscillate back to being rooted in the reality of what's going on. So that may look like, for a moment, taking a minute or two to drop, engaging with the thoughts as they were arising, or engaging with work for a moment, just to reorient into the reality of what's happening. And then as we oscillate back and forth, being engaged again, and then re-remembering what's happening, then this will become such a fluid process that it won't even take the minute or two reorienting back into what's happening. You'll always just know the reality of what's happening, even while moving forward. And so to make this all real practical and applied, it does take some finessing at first. But I think the motivation is clear. And the motivation is the quality of life that it brings. And that's what we're highlighting in these classes. All right, you guys. I hope that was clear and helpful. last and final class next week is called The Final Refuge. I look forward to sharing that with you guys.